to come in, I'll just say a couple of words about the forum. So my colleague Hannah Norberg, who is also on screen, and myself started this nearly 2 years ago. We started in October as a bit of a pandemic project with the aim of bringing people something a little like a brown bag seminar that those of us who've been through or can remember our time in university are familiar with. But the idea was to make it more policy focused than a kind of research brown bag. So what we aim to do is to build bridges. You can tell from our logo, it looks suspiciously like the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So we're trying to build bridges between practice and research. So we always like to have a little bit of new research that's being introduced in a session, but then also to make it practical. We're also trying to build bridges between the different parts of the trade policy community. So we have economists, we have lawyers, we have political scientists, we have specialists in international relations, and we have practitioners who come along to our sessions. And then, of course, we're also trying to build bridges between different parts of the world. So sometimes when you're doing trade policy, it feels like everything's happening in Washington, DC, Brussels, Geneva, these sorts of places. And so with our audience, we're very lucky to be able to diversify that a lot. And we have people tuning in from all over the world to listen to these sessions. So we're really happy to have you all on board. This is going to be our last webinar of the current series. We're going to take August off. But do stay tuned, and at the end of the webinar, we'll let you know about some plans that we've got for coming back in September. So with that, that's what the forum looks like. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you. And I'll hand over to Hannah to introduce our speakers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben, and welcome, everybody. This is supposed to be an interactive setting, so please, jump into the chat box or the Q&A. It would be great if you say hi there, or, keep your comments and questions going there. That would be really interesting, because we want this to be a conversation. And so today, good things come to those who wait. And we've waited a very long time to get Silvia back on here and get Chad on here too. So Silvia, if you haven't met her before, which means that you haven't seen all our webinars before, she is a policy analyst at the OECD. And she's also one of our volunteers who work with me and Ben to make this an even better setup, the TPR forum. And how should I describe Chad? If you only know Chad now, then you know that he is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at Peterson, and he also hosts Trade Talks. And he's also our greatest public good, because he's always thinking about new things and publishing things and writing about things that we all want to know. And he takes a deep dive and gives us the digestible form. But he's also sort of like the Kilroy, whatever you're looking into, Kilroy was here first, and Chad is like that. So he has been in a lot of conversations here at the TPR forum, with people saying, oh, Chad started that, or that was Chad's database, or whatnot, right? And so we've been wanting to have him on here for a long time, and here he is. So without further ado, I'm going to stop babbling, and I'm going to leave the floor over first to you, Silvia. So you're going to start, Silvia is first going to do her presentation, and then Chad, and then there's plenty of time for Q&A. So, and make sure that you keep these comments and questions going, because these are pros, weathered pros. And so they might actually even be able to take the questions on a roll while they're talking. And if not, Ben Shepherd's superpower is to summarize questions into digestible form and do that afterwards. So please don't be shy. Use this very rare and amazing opportunity to interact with Silvia and Chad. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah and Ben, for the extremely kind introduction, and of course the invite, as you said, Hannah, to be back in a Trade Policy Research Forum webinar. And of course, this time I'm honored to have Chad Bown as discussant, and then looking forward to the broader discussion with all participants, to whom I say hello from wherever they're connecting with us today. So I think that the topic of the discussion today is very much a relevant one, right? I think we're still fighting COVID pretty much everywhere in the world. And I just wanted to present to you today some research that we finalized recently with my good colleagues at the OECD, Andrea Andronelli and then Javier Lopez Gonzalez, and with excellent research assistant from our colleague Juan Porras. That we actually finalized this spring. And of course, things have still been evolving since then, but hopefully it will provide you a picture of some of the things that we see have happened in global supply chains for medical goods. So I will just share my screen quickly for a couple of slides. Basically, the work that we tried to do this year comes in follow-up of work looking at medical goods that we have tried to do throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, my co-authors, Andrea and Javier, they started looking all the way back in March, April 2020 at selected COVID-19 goods and how basically these different interdependencies existed throughout the world for the different products. So for the main suppliers for some of these products, what were their inputs going into them, and looking at all these kinds of good, well, we basically saw that, yes, there are definitely important trade interdependencies out there for them, and that policies also matter at the time. As you, of course, may well remember that back in March, April 2020, we were seeing, for instance, a whole bunch of export restrictions being put in place. So we thought that it was really important to start looking into these issues more in depth. Then we continue.
Okay, can I just stop you here just for a second, because I see your slides are gorgeous, and before people get super panicked about writing everything down, this webinar is being recorded. And you are also generously giving us your slides. And so all of that will be online. So you guys can just relax and listen and take it in. There will be no FOMO here.
That's a very important point to make, but I hope people will still pay attention even if they don't have to take these notes, and then keep them excited about the topic. So then in 2021 we tried to look into the good that of course became extremely topical at the time, which was vaccines. And this was right at the outset that we were starting to have the clinical tests for some of the vaccines out there. So what we did at the time is look at more regular vaccines to say so, and some of the inputs or the packaging material or items that were needed to transport and distribute them that were needed. And again, kind of a similar picture came into place, that all of these things come from different suppliers around the world, and once again that there are really important interdependencies that exist out there. We also looked a little bit deeper into other types of products such as face masks and test kits, and looking again with data from the pre-COVID period. So with information as of 2019 at the time, we saw that these were already products that were very much traded worldwide. So there seemed to be a very good basis to have supply chains that can respond to producing the products that were more specifically addressing COVID-19. So this was again another element showing these important interdependencies. So what we tried to do this year is really to look at what more new, more up-to-date information tells us on all these cross-country exports and imports, on the role of the trade played during the different stages of the pandemic. And again, we look at these three COVID-19 products. So first, face masks, which is one item that everyone really remembers from the outset of the pandemic. COVID-19 vaccines, as I was noting, of course, this is something again that became very important in the fight against the pandemic. And lastly, also COVID-19 tests, which are also a product that are still very much with us. And again, we are starting to see spikes in cases pretty much everywhere around the world. So this is one item that is definitely still much needed out there. So going first to face masks, of course, there was a big challenge for us in looking at this data is to identify the specific product, the face mask. One challenge that we have with all this trade information that we were looking at is if we look at what is known as the harmonized system 6-digit codes, as there will be very other products bundled into one of these specific codes. So we may not always be able to identify that particular COVID-19 item that we are interested in. So what we try to do with Andrea and Javier in this research is to try to dig deeper and look at some of the countries that may have introduced specific codes for some of these items. And what you can see in the chart here on the example of a face mask for the United States, where at a precise moment in 2020, it became possible to identify them more and more specifically as an individual code, is that we do see that trade with that big spike that you see in green on the chart really helped meet some of the significant shortages that we were seeing in the face of this surging demand. Another caveat, in addition to some of these product codes, is of course that we are still lacking information on domestic production, and I think this is something that Chad will also probably refer a bit later on. So this is something where we still have difficulties to see how domestic output may have also responded and have cross-country comparable information around this. But notwithstanding, we do really see that the trade helped out there to meet this spike in demand. What we also see, and again, looking at information for the United States, is that not only we had the surge in trade that helped meet some of the demand, but we were also having a gradual diversification following this spike. In parallel, of course, to some lower imported levels as we were advancing throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, we see here for the United States is that, of course, the bulk of the imports of disposable face masks still coming from China, but we had many other players that were getting a much more important role in the market, such as Mexico or Korea, for instance. The spike in demand was also common to some other major economies that we were able to look at. And you have in the charts here examples for Canada, Japan, but also European Union. So you see this sort of similar spike in those first months of the COVID pandemic. And for the United States, so we had increases of more than 1,500% in both volume and in value of trade in face masks. And this situation is something that we saw in all these other major economies. And again, looking with more precise data still for these 4 big economies, we also see a similar pattern of diversification of import sources. So while in maybe the earlier phases of the pandemic, we were seeing a higher concentration indices, this somewhat lower down as we advance through the pandemic, and we see much lower concentration pretty much throughout all these economies in the latter part of 2021. Going to the second product that we looked at, and as I was noting, we already started to explore this issue in the early stages of 2021. As vaccines were starting to get the approvals and go into the markets, and vaccination campaigns were picking up speed. But at the time, of course, the trade data was not there, and the situation changed a bit more this year. And while still for the same reasons of the product specificity, it was not possible for us to look specifically at COVID vaccines throughout all the countries that, for instance, you have in the chart here. We did see an impressive increase in trade in vaccines, which was for the countries that we cover here, and more generally globally, it was about 26% higher in the first months of 2021 than in all the year throughout 2019. So quite a significant increase. But then again, as we were able to dig deeper for some of the economies where, again, we saw the possibility of using these more targeted codes for the products that we were interested in. And you have in the chart here the example for the European Union, where a code was actually available as of January 2021 to be able to distinguish COVID-19 vaccines from any other type of vaccines. We do see that it is sort of possible to attribute this big increase to COVID vaccines more specifically. And this is what you can see in the blue part in the chart here, both what was being traded in regionally intra-EU, but also the COVID-19 vaccines that were going outside the region. It was also important for us to look into the supply chains, the different inputs that go into COVID-19 vaccines. And again, this was also possible due to not only to research that actually Chad did with Tom Boliki, looking at how different supply chains for the different types of manufacturers of COVID-19 vaccines were set up throughout the world. So we were able to identify some of the origins and then destinations of these inputs, as well as an important joint effort led by the WTO with other international organizations, but also think tanks and researchers such as Chad, to try to, again, have more specific codes for some of the inputs going into vaccines. And again, using that list, we're able, for instance, to look at groups of different consumable materials that go into the production of COVID-19 vaccines, or what you see in the chart on the right-hand side, looking at packaging materials such as vials or rubber caps to transport those afterwards. We see, again, an important increase in trade. And then for some of these consumable materials, we'd see at some point in the early stages of 2021, even an increase of more than 66%. So again, not only looking at trade in the final product, but important as well to understand how some of these supply chains work. And I'm sure Chad will come back to this in his discussion. And again, trying to dig even deeper to look at some of the more specific components to the extent possible, while of course dealing again with this issue of product codes. We managed to cover aspects such as lipid nanoparticles, which I think was quite a very topical again. Item that was really discussed even throughout the media a lot, and how different suppliers were being set up around the world. And again, Chad's research was very useful to understand where some of these suppliers were being based, where we were coming from. And looking at the example of the United States, again, we see that the imports of these category of lipid nanoparticles increased even 5 times more than what we were seeing before vaccines started to be produced at such a massive scale worldwide. And finally, looking at COVID-19 tests, again, a product that I think is very much of use today. And the specificity here is that when we're looking at this with Andrea and Javier, we were kind of looking at it in the sort of a multi-product lens, because we realize that there are really many different components that one needs, right? When you even do like an antigen test at home. So not only you need the reagents and the substance, but you also have the plastic tube where this is being kept. You have the flock nasal swab that you need to use in order to perform that test. So all kinds of different elements that you have in that antigen test box that you can get at home. And this made it even more challenging, right, to look at how the supply chain for this type of product is being constructed. But again, we saw that we could look at items such as nasal swabs. And again, with data for the United States, it was really clear that we were starting to have this large increase in trade in 2021, as these tests were coming much more into the market, and it was possible to purchase them much more widely. And again, we think that this really supported the production of tests. And also seeing here new suppliers emerging during the crisis. So you can see in this chart with the yellow line is basically Korea, which really had an impressive entry in this market, starting to produce tests. And what you can see here is really one of the products that is behind, which is laboratory reagents. But again, in 2021, we really see an impressive spike for this kind of item going into tests. So just to wrap up, before Chad's going into the discussion, is some of the key takeaways that we can have with this work is that throughout the different products that we looked at, we can say that really trade and global supply chains were key in enabling some of the sustained production and access to many of these goods. Of course, in the case of vaccines, we see that access still remains challenging in many economies. So trade is still likely to play a role in helping economies get not only vaccines, but also the inputs needed for their production. Very obviously in the case of face masks, but also some of these components for tests, we see the trade help to ease some of these temporary supply constraints. Of course, again, with the caveat that I was noting around the fact that we still need more data as well to know what was happening on the domestic production side. And of course, from the lens of global supply chains, we saw also that the trade helped enable access to some of these key components without whom it would not have been possible to produce many of these goods. So overall, of course, we need to think about policies of transparency, facilitate trade to ensure greater ease of access to this product. But of course, this is again one part of the story that we were able to look at, and I'm sure Chad will complement with more from his work. And one last point that we wanted also to make with this work is really the importance of looking at this data and thinking about risk management or any broader resilience strategy going forward in preparing for future crises or future pandemics, and reflect this in the strategies that are being developed and the policies that are being developed. So as to learn from this crisis and then take the lessons that we have from here going forward in how we think about the goods that are needed or the supply chains that are needed and their functioning. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion from Chad. Thank you.
Excellent, Sylvia. Thank you so very much. And there's the report, the link to the report for those who want to read more. All right, let's hand it over to Chad.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, let me try to share my screen and make everything work. How does that look? Can you see it?
Yeah, we see it. It's not in the full mode yet, but it's
yeah,
on there, but it's not.
Zoom thing is just, hold on a second. Let's get this right.
It might be soon, but Sylvia got
it's like, it's because I have
so.
17 screens open and none of them are, happy, trying to work at the same time. Let's try this one more time.
All right, so we'll give it one more shot.
Anyway, I'll tell a story while we're doing this. So what in the kind introduction that was given to me, the one thing that wasn't mentioned, which is actually perhaps the highlight of my career, was when it comes to Ben Shepherd. He probably doesn't even remember this, but I was on the external committee for his PhD back in the day when we were all much younger.
And
so
I totally remember this,
of my life.
I think I could even list the questions you asked, since I was rather nervous on the occasion.
So that was great. Okay, so I'm sure I'm still not at full screen, but what are you going to do? So hopefully you can see enough of it to get the gist of what I have to say. So first of all, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Sylvia and I don't think, Sylvia, we've ever met in person, but we are basically twinsies, pandemic twinsies, because we've been working on the same stuff, sharing information back and forth, And let me just say that the work that she and her team have done at the OECD throughout the pandemic has been pivotal. And it's been really hard because I have kind of independently been struggling with the same types of questions and same approaches, and really trying to, there was no template for how to deal with what we didn't know about what products were going to be important, not only final products, but inputs as well, and trying to diagnose that in real time, during a pandemic. They did an incredible set of work, and so I just want to congratulate them. My presentation, I'll briefly summarize their key messages, but I don't want to spend too much time going into it because basically she did a great job of presenting it, and I agree with everything that she said and everything that she highlighted. So trade has absolutely been critical during the pandemic, and they walk through a number of goods for which that's been the case. Respirators and masks, the N95 or FF or whatever you call them there in Europe, FFF, PPPs, vaccines themselves, tests, other critical materials to go into all of that. But then also trade has been critical for imported inputs in order to be able to make those things. So you will have none of those outputs unless the firms that are making them can get access to inputs. And that's where global supply chains come in. So all of that I agree with completely. The stories that she told about the entry of new suppliers was also critical. Some of that was diversification. Some of that was literally just new products being created from scratch. So in some sense, when it comes to vaccines, all of these companies that made these vaccines were new suppliers. Nobody had ever made or invented a COVID vaccine before. So the supply chains that emerged were critical too. This challenge that she mentioned of product classifications being buried within other product categories was absolutely important. And that just goes to show how difficult it is for trade analysts to be able to contribute during all of this. When the pandemic first hit here in the United States in February, March of 2020, the first thing where it came up, and this was pre-export restrictions, is we became aware in the United States that the Trump administration was still imposing trade war tariffs on China for N95 respirators. So you have the Secretary of Health and Human Services saying the stockpile of these things in the United States has already been depleted. We have no more. Hospital workers, doctors and nurses, they're wearing garbage bags. They can't get access to any of this stuff. And yet we still have trade war tariffs on this stuff coming in from China. So the very first piece that I wrote required me going to my friends who are like in the healthcare profession, doctors and folks like that, and saying, okay, this pandemic thing seems serious. What supplies do you need to be able to deal with patients? And so that's when they listed off the things like, well, we're going to need N95 respirators and hospital gowns and face shields and goggles and shoe coverings and hair nets. And then we're going to need ventilators and the pulsimeters and all these kinds of things. And so then I took that and tried to figure out, well, where in the US case, in the harmonized tariff schedule, do those things come up? So I reached out to the industry association to try to have them get me a product list. And then I found out folks like Silvia were doing exactly the same thing and struggling with that, right? And so this is just, it's incredibly challenging to do something like this in real time. And so the effort that the international organizations have put into this of trying to establish for future pandemics, the preparedness of coming up with these indicative product lists, is even that in and of itself is incredibly important. Okay, all of that work, lots of interesting stories there if folks want to talk more about that. But let me go into a little bit of data, and I want to dig into not disagreeing again with anything that Silvia illustrated, which I think was exactly right. But I wanted to tweak things and go into a couple of different angles when it comes to things like PPE and vaccines, because I've also looked at both in a lot of depth. So I will agree that trade was amazing for personal protective equipment. Let's start there. But it was amazing only eventually. And initially, the lack of trade was a huge, huge problem in Europe. We saw the export controls, the unprecedented between EU member state export controls. You weren't allowed, France requisitioned, equipment for their medical workers. Germany banned exports, even to each other, right? As Italy, Spain was suffering in March of 2020, the EU member states imposed export bans on each other. And that was because one of the reasons was we lacked a sufficient amount of imports. Now, why we lacked imports was completely understandable. We saw China, which is where the epicenter of this thing started. Markets worked as you would expect it. They had a huge drop off in exports because they needed more of this stuff to be consumed locally. And they actually started importing things like masks and respirators and protective garments that the hospital workers have to wear, right? But that is a huge problem because it turns out that China is the major global residual supplier of so many different pieces of this PPE. And excuse me, here in the United States and Washington, we have fire trucks and things going by. That was a huge problem, right? Right when the world needed these supplies, they weren't available because China's where the residual production was and they needed them too, right? I'm not saying that they imposed export restrictions. It could have just been natural supply and demand reasons that this was taking place. But you see, here what this is essentially, and I can speak as I'm not at an international organization or a government person, I can actually call out specific countries here. You can see that this ultimately happened. Ultimately, by April, May, China started exporting tremendous amounts. Its volumes did crazy well, but also export prices went up in response to that as well, just reflecting huge demand out there in the rest of the world. So yes, while trade was ultimately beneficial, the lack of trade early on was a huge problem. So what do we learn from that? Well, in response, some countries, including the United States, have undertaken major industrial policy to try to reduce the resilience on, especially China, but probably globally, personal protective equipment. We've spent over $1 billion to build out a domestic PPE supply chain for lots of these different products over the last 2 years. And so looking at this from the perspective of domestic policymakers, what should your pandemic preparedness look like? Well, you need to have access to stockpiles and you'll be able to manage your inventory until imports can arrive and until you can scale up domestic production. But you also need massive transparency. And this is beyond the transparency that we normally talk about in trade circles, right? Transparency about import restrictions or export restrictions. That's not the kind of transparency we need here. I need to have, if I'm going to trust China or any trading partner as being a potential source of PPE to satisfy my needs in an emergency, I need to see what their internal demand and supply looks like so I know when it's going to be coming. Because the shortages didn't necessarily arise because of export restrictions. They arose because of supply and demand conditions in other countries. Right? So we need more transparency if we're going to be interdependent in this sort of way. And this is not something that we normally talk about in the trade context. And then finally, if you need to surge local production, scale up domestic production in order to meet pandemic needs, well, you may actually need to have some local production to begin with. It's really difficult to expand production when you have no local domestic industry. And then even if you have some domestic industry, who to subsidize requires knowing, what firms are actually producing this stuff locally. In the United States, we found that we just lacked all this information. Okay, so lots to learn about on the PPE side. On vaccines, there was a lot of controversy here as well in terms of trade policy that I want to spend a couple of minutes on. So first, and again, we have to remember who was in charge in the United States during this time period. When the pandemic hit, it was the Trump administration. There is no one on the policy side who had been more critical of the Trump administration over the previous 3 years than me when it comes to trade. But when it came to the vaccine pandemic response, not pandemic response when it came to PPE or masking or messaging or anything like that, but when it came to vaccine pandemic response, their approach was the best of anyone out there in the world. They did this thing called Operation Warp Speed. And the main characteristics of this policy were basically twofold. One, there was incredible diversification across vaccine candidates. So they initially gave massive subsidies to 6 vaccine candidates in case any of them didn't work out in their clinical trials. And when most of them didn't work out, it was good that they had that diversification. And the second was they gave subsidies early and at risk. So even during the phase of when it was unclear whether any given one of these vaccine candidates was going to make it through the clinical trial process. The US government gave funding to the companies and said, these are brand new products. Please set up your manufacturing facilities. Please set up your supply chain relationships. Start manufacturing these things now, even though we're not going to know if they're going to be authorized or not until 4, 5, 6 months from now, so that when they ultimately are authorized, we'll have vaccine doses right away. This is why you saw, and this is what the chart shows, why the United States have earlier access to vaccine doses than Europe, India, anybody else, with the exception of China. We'll talk about China separately. They're a whole separate story, right? This is critical. This is what the kind of thing that we want to encourage other countries to be able to do. Yeah, ultimately, the EU did expand and produce more vaccines than the United States. India did as well. But those places failed their populations because they didn't invest at risk. They could have saved, hundreds of thousands of lives earlier in the pandemic if they had been willing to invest in getting these vaccine manufacturing facilities going during the clinical trial process. Okay, there was the problem of input shortages, which led to this dust up between the United States and India, also a little bit in Europe. Companies accusing the United States of imposing an export ban, export embargo, export restriction on inputs, when the key problem was input shortages. And the big takeaways from there, and again, I looked at the data, there was no ban, there were shortages. I'm sure everybody wanted more of these inputs, but there was no input ban. This is an interesting data diagnosis story, and we were able to share some of this with the folks at the WTO when they came up with their indicative list last summer. And basically here, the approach was to utilize the bills of lading data that Panjiva, one of these private data collection companies, had put together. And this was, these charts originally came from some work I did with Chris Rogers at Panjiva. And there in the bills of lading data that India reports, and it's publicly available, you can figure out for a company like the Serum Institute or Biological E, one of these vaccine manufacturers, from whom they were sourcing their key inputs back in the United States or anywhere else. So you can figure out what the company was. Then they have the description of the product as well as the HS whatever 8-digit code. And then you can match that. And this is what I was doing. I was Googling, oh, I want a bioreactor that's 500 liters, blah, blah, blah. And I could Google it and see what the price was to figure out what was that the exact product that was critical for vaccine production. And you can kind of back out what these key product lists were. And if you didn't do that, then you were stuck with the same sort of problem that Silvia had identified for masks. Some of these key vaccine inputs just fell into, all other, rubber products or all other consumable materials, and you didn't know if it was the right one, right? But using this really detailed input-output supplier relationship bills of lading data could help us identify what the critical inputs actually were. All right, final policy implications, my last slide. For governments in terms of their pandemic response, they need to subsidize across multiple vaccine sponsors. So now we know it's Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, but it could have been CureVac, it could have been Novavax, it could have been some of these other companies as well, right? So we need to diversify across companies and at risk. Get them going so that they're ready to provide doses right away upon regulatory authorization. The second thing, though, is in order to deal with this input shortage problem, you actually need to be able to provide subsidies, production capacity enhancing subsidies along the entire supply chain. And that's really, really hard when some of your input suppliers are located abroad, right? The key issue in the US, Europe vaccine input supply chain was not that the United States was having export restrictions on these critical inputs. It's just there weren't enough of the inputs. Those major economies should have jointly subsidized the input companies to get them to expand their production capacity. The price mechanism wasn't observed down the supply chain. The price signal, I should say, wasn't observed down the supply chain far enough for the input providers to see that, oh, we should be expanding, doubling our production lines, tripling our production lines so that we can scale up and meet this huge demand of inputs, right? And you need government policymakers to step in there. Or to do that, you need to have transparency into the supply chain. You need to know who those input suppliers are. And that's really tricky for governments to figure out. And then finally, that transparency will help us hopefully avoid in the future misunderstandings between input shortages and export restricting policies. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much to you both. I think that was a really kind of rich set of insights that we got out of both the presentations. So I'm really grateful for that. Again, anyone who's listening to us, please feel free to jump in the comment box or the Q&A box and let us know if you have questions or comments. Before we go into the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone of the disclaimer that we had on the slide that I put up right at the beginning, which is that everyone's speaking in a personal capacity. And when I say everyone, I mean particularly Silvia. So no one is representing OECD or any other organization here. It's purely personal thoughts. So with that, Silvia, let me ask you a couple of questions. So, you know, one thing that really interested me in all the data that you showed is this drive towards diversification. And I think it's a really important story to get out there. So, you know, congratulations to you guys for sort of really diving into this and telling that story. But I want to go a step back and, you know, now that we know that that happened and we sort of see the ways in which it happened, what do we know about what the policy drivers were? Or, you know, were there even policy drivers, or is this basically a commercial story of sort of firms in one part of the supply chain taking their own sort of steps to kind of limit stock out risk and all this sort of thing by diversifying the supply chain? Or was it something that governments were actively trying to bring about? Is this something that you guys were able to get any insight into?
Thanks, Ben, for that question, and then thanks, Chad, for the comments and the discussion. That was extremely useful, and I think there's definitely a lot of food for thought going forward in there. And I think that's an extremely interesting question, Ben. On our side, we unfortunately didn't get to dig that much information, I think, on that domestic policy side throughout the different products or inputs that we were looking at. But I think it definitely links to some of the issues that Chad was raising. It is probably a bit of a mix between the commercial opportunity and some of these domestic policies that we have been seeing in terms of support from government. I think maybe thinking around the example of the test kits where we saw Korea, who was already one of the players or one of the important players, I think, in around the substance of laboratory reagents that are very much part of the different tests in general, including what was then used after in COVID-19 tests. I think part of it was definitely these companies exploiting their commercial capacity, their links to different suppliers, and being able to come into the market and produce this new product in addition to some of the other tests that they were producing. But also, I think probably direct support from the government in this sense. I cannot specifically say about subsidies there because it's something that we not really look at, but I think generally probably even other types of policies in terms of some regulatory flexibility, probably faster approval process of some of these products. So I think generally it has been a mix, but then in the types of domestic policies, that's something that we haven't had the chance to get that much information on.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, you raised some really good points there. And you know, in the answer you mentioned kind of the set of countries that we were seeing, you know, come up more visibly in the graph. And, you know, Korea and China really sort of stood out to me. So, you know, the China story, I think I knew to some extent. Korea, we know anecdotally, but I was really interested kind of by that. And I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit, because, you know, those are two countries that we normally see in quite different parts of the value chain in many areas. You know, Korea being a high income country, extensive use of robotics in manufacturing, all this kind of stuff. China often at a sort of lower value added point in the value chain, admittedly changing over recent years. Is that something, again, that, and I appreciate that, you know, the data may or may not speak to this, but were you getting a sense that they were actually competing in the same part of the value chain, or were they sort of undertaking different activities in order to be kind of the exporter of record for these particular goods?
Again, maybe jump in. I definitely want to hear Chad's thoughts on this one. I think again it may be a mix of of different things. I mean, I think we see China as definitely an important supplier throughout some of these different final products, including vaccines, but also some of the different inputs, like when we were looking at some of the consumable materials that go into vaccines. You know, China was also appearing as an important supplier there. So I think you see there a capacity to produce across some of these different things, while maybe others have definitely been much more specialized. Again, I don't think we have looked that much into this question of knowing, okay, what kind of products were they producing up to then, or what kind of technology was going into that, whether how much was that like sort of a basis to get into the new markets, maybe such as the example you were noting about Korea. But I think for tests, they were definitely capitalizing on the structures that they were already having. So I think it's probably a bit of a mix. But I think with Chad looking much more deeply into how these, like for instance, supply chains and COVID vaccines came together, I think he may have an additional point to make there.
Well, let me maybe flip to Chad on that, because we've had a couple of questions in the Q&A box that are specifically directed to this kind of subsidies question. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. And you know, I think one of the questions we've had in particular is going to this kind of mechanism distinction between like a classic subsidy and an advanced market commitment. So I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit about the mechanics of how this worked in the US, and you know, to what extent you know, government commitments to purchase and all this sort of thing is really speaking to that issue that you mentioned of getting in at the stage where this is actually risky, where government is taking on some of the risk of development of these products.
Yeah, and so thank you, and thank you for the questions in the chat too. And so I slipped through it, but if the slides are made available at the end, I have references there which provide links to the kind of all the work that I've done, including just put out a recent piece that sort of describes the Defense Production Act and how it was done on the case of vaccines. So let me briefly summarize it. So when it comes to the Defense Production Act and vaccines, the details of how the Defense Production Act work are fascinating. So as an economist especially, right? So we imagine we write down these models where you have a social planner. Well, with the Defense Production Act, it is like the government is the micromanaging social planner at some level, right? So so think about it like this. The US government goes to a company like Moderna, right? And Moderna is a biotech. They've got this great idea for a vaccine, but they've actually never made anything before in their entire history. They have no production facilities. They're like a bunch of smart people sitting in a lab dreaming up stuff, right? Well, we turns out we like your vaccine and we'd like you to make, you know, a few billion doses of it for the world. And they've never made anything, right? They've never sold any commercial products. Okay, well, what happens is the federal government through the Defense Production Act and what are called a priority rated contract taps Moderna on the shoulder and says, here's your contract. You have to do this for us before you're allowed to do anything else for anybody else on the planet. That includes you've got to make these vaccines for us before you can make vaccines for anybody else. You know, or you could think if you were a multi-product firm, right, you've got to do this for us before you make any other products for anybody else, like even commercial products. But that wasn't the case for Moderna, but it would have been the case for like a Pfizer, say. But Moderna's never made anything before. So they have to go out and hire contract manufacturers to actually do the production for them. So they tap, you know, what's called a CDMO, a contract development manufacturing organization, one of the biggest ones in the world. Lonza is actually headquartered in Switzerland, and they say, okay, you're going to be the one to manufacture our vaccines for us. Now, the way the Defense Production Act works, though, is Moderna tells Lonza, I was just tapped on the shoulder by the US government So now I'm tapping you on the shoulder and you have to do this for me before you're allowed to do anything for anybody else either. So these priority contracting, right? This wartime powers actually flows through the supply chain. Now, it won't flow outside of the United States. There's no, legal authorities for Lonza's plants in Switzerland, right? The US can't say, hey, to the Swiss government, could you make sure that the Lonza plant in Switzerland is actually prioritizing vaccines before, so it only works in the United States, but within the United States, this power is amazing, right? You're actually then you can go to all your input suppliers and say, you've got to give me this next batch of some particular chemical before you give it to anybody else, right? And so that's how the Defense Production Act worked. Now, you can also understand how if you're a vaccine manufacturer, anybody else in the world, the Serum Institute in India or CureVac in Germany or anybody, and are looking for inputs from the United States at the same time from these same companies, because you too are trying to set up your vaccine supply chain. And the company is telling you, I can't sell you any inputs right now because my stuff has all been prioritized by the US government. So there's, I can't make it anymore. I can't make any more of this kind of stuff. In any case, that's how it works. And it's amazing in practice, but then when you start to think about, well, now we're cross-border supply chains, we're global, we need to kind of think about how to do that in an emergency at a global scale. And that requires transparency. And that also probably requires making sure that those not only contracts, but the subsidies for how much we want you to increase your capacity reflect not only what the vaccines and the manufacturers in the US wanted, but also we're going to be needed in India, in Europe, and elsewhere. Then there come up questions, well, should the US government be the one paying for that? I mean, for the subsidy, for the inputs that are going to be used elsewhere in the world? I mean, on public health grounds, yeah, getting everybody vaccinated is good for the world. But getting, cheaper access or quicker access to inputs for a, Indian company or a European company, it's not normal for one government to subsidize the inputs for another. So anyway, all sorts of coordination questions, I think now for international cooperation that we have to think about and consider in a different context.
Let me actually pick that up. So the international cooperation question is an interesting one. So, on the one hand, you've been talking about sort of what the lay of the land looks like if you're a large country with manufacturing capacity in this area. What if you're not? If you're a government sitting in a smaller, lower income country where you've got no capacity to manufacture pharmaceuticals at all, let alone these very sophisticated kinds of vaccines, what's your optimal policy response? What do you actually do to try and get all of this stuff flowing? That was for you, Chad, if you want to.
Yeah, thanks. Now I'll let Silvia try to answer it. Well, so look, I think over the long run, I think the way I think about this question is it's kind of twofold. There's a long run. Do we want more globally distributed manufacturing of pharmaceutical products and especially vaccines and additional diversification? I think the answer to that is yes, especially if we're heading into a world where you've got all kinds of shocks. And again, we saw vaccine production here in the United States. We got very lucky. We had plants of Pfizer that produced the best vaccine, Moderna that produced the second best vaccine, or whatever. But we also had plants producing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that completely botched it. It had to get shut down for many, many months. And this is the highest technology country in the world still screwed up vaccine manufacturing. It's just a hard thing to do. And let alone the geopolitics, let alone maybe we have climate shocks, maybe we have all input, whatever. So we need arguably over the longer term, I agree, globally diverse production of this kind of stuff. That being said, in the midst of a pandemic, when all we want to do is save lives, where we're not really thinking about long-term development strategies in the midst of a pandemic, we have hundreds of thousands of people dying every month. We just want to save lives, right? There, I think arguably is not the moment to focus on how do we teach folks how to develop and manufacture a new vaccine. No, we need to figure out how to increase scale as quickly as possible to get as many vaccines produced as quickly as possible, so then we can get them through trade distributed to the world as quickly as possible to save lives.
So if I could maybe just pick that up, if we're thinking of kind of long-term versus short-term, long-term, something like a TRIPS waiver To the extent, I'm going to leave to one side the extent to which, the previous public health declaration on TRIPS already dealt with these kinds of issues. So I'm not a lawyer, not going to opine as to whether or not we actually need another document. But imagine that we do. Is that something that falls more into the long-term category? And what you're saying is short-term, whoever produces the most of this stuff produces as much as they can, and then we deal with the shipping and all this sort of thing as the priority issue.
I guess the way I think about it, and Sylvia, do jump in here and obviously correct me, because you're going to be more expert on some of these things than I am. The way I would think about it is, especially, so speed was so important, and diversification was so important. For smaller countries, we can imagine a world in which, even in the best case scenario, smaller, even like Canada or UK is a really good example, right? The UK, by and large, was the closest facsimile to what the United States did in terms of investing at risk and early and trying to get supply chains set up, and they diversified. But the issue for the UK was they ultimately picked vaccine candidates that didn't work. So they got stuck. They had one that worked, which was AstraZeneca, some local production, but that wasn't sort of the best one. And so the way they were able to compensate that relatively quickly was through imports, Pfizer, that were coming in from the continent, from Belgium and Germany, right? So that's realistically what most countries are going to end up with. Canada, if they have developed a vaccine manufacturing, the next pandemic, right, they might subsidize one or two. But if you're doing that at risk, and you want to do this at risk because you want doses early, then you might very well be the country that ends up picking the wrong candidate. So trade ultimately is going to be essential to any of this kind of stuff. Now, TRIPS waiver, I'm not a big fan. I think that a lot of time, unfortunately, was wasted on that issue because it's not a short-run solution. And I think a really interesting thing that's happening now, if you want to see how challenging IP technology transfer is follow what's happening in the therapeutic space. Mm-hmm. Through the medicines patent pool, and what Pfizer and Merck are voluntarily doing with Paxlovid and Molnupiravir. So they're COVID antiviral pills, and the system works, the institution works. They each have like 30 generic manufacturers around the world that have signed up to potentially transfer the license to be able to manufacture this stuff, and yet none of this stuff is getting manufactured yet. Because there's all other sorts of problems of scaling up manufacturing, and that's oral antivirals, which are much easier to produce than vaccines. Sorry, I've gone on.
No, these are great points, but let me flip it back to Hannah. I'm not sure if you want to come in with questions or comments as well.
Can I just add one little thing to, as chat prompted me on that? I think, one big realization, of course, it didn't come as a surprise to trade economists, but maybe to others, it was much more revealing. I think really like the intricacies of all these supply chains and the so many things that you need to make this together. I think it also shows that there is a space for everyone to find where they are most productive, where they have the most comparative advantage to come in as part of this supply chain. So I think one important thing not to forget that is really not just about the final product, but about a multitude of inputs. And we were seeing this with vaccines. And if you do have a chance to go and look at this list that the WTO led and to which we had both contributed, you will see that it's like quite a few pages long, and all those different inputs come from different places. You have different manufacturers in all those countries. So I think that's really important not to forget. And these are the kind of inputs that you can use maybe for the medical goods that you will need for the next pandemic. So again, having that capacity out there and then being conscious that there are a multitude of different things coming together, I think it's important.
And can I say one more thing before Hannah starts, because Hannah will appreciate this. So one input that we thought was actually going to be really, really important when it came to vaccines early in the pandemic was an adjuvant that's used in some of them, but was particularly important for the Novavax vaccine. But because Novavax was slow and never came along, it never really materialized. But the adjuvant was from the Chilean soapbark tree, right? And so these trees are really only grown in Chile. So Chile is a key input provider there. But then they were also, at least pre-pandemic, only refined into the adjuvant themselves in Sweden. So you would cut down the tree in Chile, ship the stuff to Sweden, and they would turn it into the adjuvant, right? So we were anticipating, oh my gosh, this was going to be a huge supply chain bottleneck when we actually get to the stage of scaling up production. But then it never materialized because that one never made it through phase 3 trials in time, to be of use. So agree with Silvia, but again, it goes to this point of how important diversification is too, because even ex ante, we don't know upfront which of these inputs are going to be critical at the end of the day or not. And that's why I think we also, have to cooperate and be open to trade with each other.
Thank you, Chad. I did appreciate that, of course. Well, I have one comment and then one question to each of you, and we're running out of time. So Ben, you might want to summarize everything else while I babble. First of all, I think that trade policy was really tried during the pandemic. So we, as Chad pointed out, we all of a sudden had export bans within EU countries. It's a big thing. It's a single market. It's not, So first of all, that was really putting the lens at what really is trade policy in the EU. Secondly, what I think that a lot of people did not understand, and that has not been appreciated enough, is that vaccines is not an EU competency. So the whole investing in making sure that EU has a pool was something that we weren't supposed to be able to do at all. And so finding the money for that and setting that whole policy up is a huge endeavor. And so getting the EU to be a player in this is huge and an important step for next time. So with that, my question to Chad is, China is a very hot potato, especially in the US. What do you think is the China story that should be told from COVID? And to Silvia, what's your message to policymakers?
Yeah, so 2 words on China. I think that in retrospect, it kind of did what we would have expected and would have wanted it to. But I think the challenge in terms of eventually it was able to export, especially PPE, and saved probably hundreds of thousands of lives around the world in response to that. The challenge, though, and this is not a China problem, I'm not blaming China, was in the early months of the pandemic, it wasn't exporting, it was importing, and it never imports PPE because it's such a huge producer. And that was a problem for the world. And that suggests why we need to have increased diversification and other strategies to manage that. Arguably, there was excessive concentration of PPE in one geographic location, and that created problems and vulnerabilities for the world. I wish its vaccines had worked better. And I think there's challenges that China faces in sort of following our standard international practices of regulatory trials so I won't go into more of that kind of stuff. But ultimately, they did export a lot of vaccines. It's just, it would have been better if they had worked better and we'd had more information on their sort of clinical trials as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Not a lot of people realize that like 90-something% of all toothbrushes are made in one city in China. So yeah, Silvia.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Chad, for those thoughts. So to policymakers, I think maybe 3 things. I think first, we do need to better invest in data. And I think we do have like a wealth of data that comes, for instance, from Customs Administration, where we do have like this broader product classification that I think we can use in a much better way if these are more accessible, more user-friendly for analysis, but also for these kind of things that we were discussing in terms of transparency and a bit of predictability, what happens in the market, as well as domestic information on the domestic production. I think this is, again, and Chad was also referring to that, knowing what is happening in the domestic markets in terms of demand, in terms of output. I think that's something that we're missing. Second, continue working with the private sector. I think, again, and Chad's different examples were also reflecting that there is a lot of space, particularly as we continue to prepare for different kinds of crises to cooperate better between governments and then private sectors to think about some of these challenges and solutions. And third, cooperate with each other. I think this is something that we wanted to put as message all throughout the crisis. And you all mentioned some of the discussions that have been going on at the WTO. I think that was a good outcome to see that there was a response to the pandemic, and which really covered a lot of different things. So there were also mentions around the regulatory cooperation, trade facilitation. So again, I think there are a lot of wealth of policies that one needs to think at. And there are things also going on in other fora, such as G7, G20, again, in terms of cooperation that I think remain important and need to materialize in this preparedness.
Well, listen, thanks very much to both of you. We've gone a little bit over time, so thanks for bearing with us. We really appreciate that. It's been a hugely informative session. It's been great for me personally. I know that everyone here has really gotten a lot out of it. In terms of things that I take away, you know, one is that as trade economists, I think we can all say, well, thank goodness that we've been working a lot on supply chains recently, because this has given us a great opportunity to actually do some of this stuff. I mean, you guys were doing it in real time, which I think is pretty amazing to be able to do, meaning that there's this kind of wealth of knowledge already behind us, stuff that we already know how to do. And, you know, it was a case of going through, as Chad was describing, making the calls, as Silvia was describing, going through the tariff classifications as they're changing and kind of tracking what's going on. So again, I think in terms of policy messages, you know, cooperation is something that I'm hearing come up a lot, and I think it's always a key question in trade policy, and I think the pandemic has made it all that more important. I must say, one alarming thing that I take away from the seminar is that the three of you, including Hannah, were talking about the next one. I'm not sure that I'm ready to do that yet, so that's. I'm going to have to go and, you know, have an extra cup of coffee after hearing that. But look, thanks to everyone for being here. It was a great session. As I said at the beginning, we're taking a break over the Northern Summer, so we won't have a webinar during August. But do keep your eyes peeled. We'll be back in September with another research webinar. In the meantime, please visit our website. We'll put the slides up so you can freely access those. We'll have a recording of the session up on YouTube for anyone who'd like to take a look at it. And of course, you can go to the website and sign up for our mailing list if you'd like to stay fully abreast of everything we're doing. So with that, thanks everyone. Have a lovely Northern Summer for those who are taking some time off, and we'll be back in September.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank
Bye.
you. And also LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great way to connect and maybe continue the conversation if they didn't get their questions asked with Chad. Chad, you're not on LinkedIn. Twitter maybe there. And Silvia on LinkedIn. And to continue the conversation amongst us.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much. Really
Thanks, everyone.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.